path. One view affirms the ultimate validity of the different paths and goals. From this perspective, the Arahant ideal and the Bodhisattva path are both seen as valid choices, along with the ideal of the Pratyeka Buddha, the solitary enlightened one. And so both the Arahant disciple and the Buddha are seen as equally enlightened and equally liberated. From this standpoint, the Arahant ideal is affirmed as valid for the typical Buddhist follower, while the Bodhisattva path is praised as the special vehicle for a person of excellent, or rather special aspirations. So this attitude or perspective treats the old Arahant path, or the Shravaka disciple model, with respect and admiration, while holds up the Bodhisattva path as the fitting vehicle for those of deep compassion who wish to confer the highest benefits on the world. So on this view, the two paths, together with the path of the Pratyeka Buddha, become three valid vehicles, the choice of which is left to the individual practitioner. The other view that's found in the Mahayana Sutras holds that there is ultimately only one valid and true vehicle to enlightenment, and that is the Bodhisattva vehicle leading to full Buddhahood. And from this perspective, the paths of the Arahant disciples and the Pratyeka Buddhas are merely preliminary or temporary stages that the Buddha set up as skillful means for those who lack the rigorous determination at the outset to follow the Bodhisattva path to Buddhahood. So from this perspective, eventually all aspirations for enlightenment must enter the universal Buddha vehicle, which then comes to be called the one vehicle. So this is the perspective which is extolled especially in the Lotus Sutra, Fa Hua Jing. Now, myself as a very ordinary human being, don't feel qualified to make any authoritative pronouncements about these different points of view. But in my opinion, the quality that's needed to bridge and to integrate the two major traditions, that is the tradition of early Buddhism, represented today by the Theravada school, and the Mahayana tradition, is respect for their own distinctive understanding of the Buddha's teachings. And when I use the word understanding, I see this as something that goes beyond mere tolerance to an attempt to arrive at a deep mutual understanding based on critical inquiry and questioning. And I think to establish this integration, the followers of the Mahayana must acknowledge the validity of the records available to us about the historical development of Buddhism, and must be willing to accept the distinction between the different layers in the evolution of Buddhism without conflating them in the legend that the Buddha taught them all during his lifetime. Of course, we can never achieve absolute certainty about what the Buddha taught, but I say that there's what I call a probability spectrum, stretching from perhaps at the most 85 to 90% to, well, I'd say it goes at the bottom end to 0%. And so at the 85, 90% end of the spectrum, I would put things like the first discourse, the teaching on non-self, many of the suttas from the Samyutta Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya. Going towards the other end, I'd put a number of suttas from the Digha Nikaya, which seem a little suspicious to me. I'd say that there's some possibility even that the Buddha did give actual teachings on the Bodhisattva path, which didn't come to literary expression till several generations after his passing, but certainly the Mahayana sutras that we have today would be close to 15 or 10% of the scale of historical probabilities. Okay, so what I would say is the need to excuse me. To recognize the historical development of Buddhist thought. And then on the other side, the followers of the Theravada must recognize the capacity of Buddhism to undergo genuine historical transformations that are not just deviations or degenerations, but which bring to light potentials in the ancient teaching, transformations that enrich the Buddhist tradition in terms of its philosophy, values, and spiritual practices, as well as in its literature, arts, and culture. And I would say now that as Buddhism has come to the West, we now have a somewhat unique opportunity which has never been available to Buddhists since Buddhism disappeared from India in the 11th century. And that is for the followers of the different Buddhist traditions to encounter each other, to be able to study each other's literature, to learn their respective practices, and to develop a kind of deep dialogue aimed at mutual understanding. And so now we have situations, especially what has been very encouraging to me is to see that many people now who are following Zen Buddhism and even Vajrayana Buddhism are now studying the Nikayas, because through the Asian Buddhist traditions, those teachings were simply not available to them. And so I think it's extremely important for Buddhist followers of all traditions to learn those teachings which form the bedrock or the fountainhead of the entire Buddhist tradition. And also I think the encounter of Buddhist traditions gives the followers of Theravada the chance to be exposed to the teachings of other traditions and to see how Buddhism has adapted first to different Asian cultures rooted in different cultural backgrounds, and how Buddhism can adapt and change to fit the current environment in the United States. But I also feel that it would be a mistake to think that once Buddhism had reached a certain number of historical forms, Theravada, Zen, Tibetan Vajrayana, that means the end to the growth and development of Buddhism. And all we can do is attempt to understand our different traditions. To use an analogy, if we take a strain of rice from Thailand and plant it in Louisiana, over several generations, it will undergo significant changes. It will have to respond to a different climate, different soil, different methods of cultivation, and in time it might even have to be classified as a completely new strain of rice. And I think the same will hold true of Buddhism. And one way that I think Buddhism should evolve in order to manifest its potential is by developing a more articulate voice in response to the great social, economic, and political issues of our time. This is an area where I have to say very frankly, I find that many traditional Buddhists sort of draw back and tend to withdraw within themselves as though this is a dangerous area to enter, something that's going to corrupt and defile the pure Dharma. But we see what's happened with Christianity, and I'm not talking about the fundamentalists who say that the earth started 6,000 years ago and climate change is a hoax perpetrated by corrupt scientists. But we see that the the Christians have been at the forefront of the struggle for civil rights amongst African Americans back in the 1960s, and now they're at the forefront in the struggle for worker rights in the cities where workers are paid minimum wages. I've gone on some campaigns. I'm the only Buddhist there. I'm surrounded usually by African American ministers, and I find them really inspiring, exhilarating, enlightening. The force of their commitment, the power of their conscience. And I'm wondering, where are all of our Buddhists? No disrespect to the four sublime states, meditation retreats, but too much for the Buddhists. Loving kindness and compassion means you sit quietly and meditate. May all beings be well, may all beings be happy, may all beings be free from suffering. But when it comes to doing something, we're afraid to act. It's going to corrupt the pure Dharma. Okay, so generally Buddhism attracts people in the West because it seems to offer us a path to inner peace, with big capital letters, find inner peace, take up the Buddha's teaching, learn to deal with the tensions of daily life, and we're attracted to the image of the Buddha sitting quietly, imperturbably, peacefully with his legs folded. But the Buddha didn't sit with the legs folded through 45 years, but he walked over the highways and villages and towns of ancient India, teaching people at their own levels, teaching farmers at their levels, village heads at their levels, teaching kings the way to administer a kingdom. Okay, so I believe that if Buddhism is really to respond to the needs of our age, it must find a way to express in concrete action the great compassion which lies at the heart of the Buddha's ministry. So it won't be sufficient, it's not sufficient for us merely to adopt the Buddha's teachings as a road to personal self-fulfillment. A predominantly personal approach to spiritual growth falls short of the Buddha's own revolutionary program, and I would say that it misses half his message. The Buddha's mission was to uproot the evil roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. And today, greed, hatred, and delusion are not merely factors in the minds of individual people, but rather they've taken on, we can call systematic and institutional embodiments. So we see greed at work in the global corporations that are extending their reach across the world, crushing whole populations with minimum wages, with environmental despoliation. We see hatred at work in the arms manufacturers and the conflicts taking place, the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, now the Ukraine, within the Ukraine, in other, actually even in Buddhist countries now, sadly, even in Sri Lanka and Burma, between Buddhists and Muslims. We can see this manifestation in hatred, in ethnic and religious antagonism that claims thousands of lives each day. And we can see delusion at work in the strategies of the fossil fuel corporations, which use public relations campaigns to convince us that climate change is a hoax and that we can go on burning oil, gas, and coal without destroying the vital biosystems that support human life on Earth. So, as I see it, the present challenge facing Buddhism today is to raise the Buddha's mission to a global scale, not merely by promoting the Dharma as a private journey to some mystical state called enlightenment, but by helping those subject to the bitterest forms of suffering receive justice and equity in their treatment. I see this as the face that Buddhism must assume if it's to continue the Buddha's ongoing mission. Okay, with this I will end my talk, and Thank you for your attention. Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break, and then I'll go over to Taishu Hall, and I'll let Venerable Dhammadippa come up and answer questions.